He was the man no one thought could break. Jonathan Hale, Denver's Millionaire CEO, the man who commanded boardrooms with nothing more than a glance. But one ordinary morning, in front of his directors, his voice faltered and his body gave way. The room froze, suits scattered, whispers collided, and as paramedics rushed in, only one voice pierced through the panic. Not his brother, not a doctor, his secretary. "Please, don't leave me." Why would she whisper his name with such tenderness? Why did her touch carry a weight no one could explain? And what secret bond could shatter the polished walls of power and ambition? From that moment, nothing inside Hale & Co. would ever be the same. Loyalties would be tested. Betrayals would surface. A velvet box, a forgotten letter, and a truth long buried would force Jonathan and Sarah Whitmore, the woman no one noticed, to face a question bigger than business, bigger than survival. What truly remains when power fades? Stay with us, because this story will move you in ways you don't expect. And before we begin, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a story that touches the heart long after it ends. The boardroom of Hale & Co. always felt like a place that could crush the air out of anyone who wasn't used to its weight. It wasn't just the polished mahogany table that stretched almost 20 feet, or the massive windows overlooking downtown Denver, casting a hard glare of the Colorado sun across the glassy surfaces. It was the way silence lived in that room, thick, commanding, expectant. Every meeting began with that silence, and it was always broken by one man, Jonathan Hale. He had been the CEO for over 2 decades, a man whose reputation for precision and authority was as ironclad as the skyscraper they sat in. He wasn't just a leader, he was a symbol. The directors, the shareholders, even the interns whispered about him with the kind of awe usually reserved for legends. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver beginning to streak through his dark hair, Jonathan seemed untouchable. That morning, he stood at the head of the table, hands resting lightly on the surface as he spoke about projections, mergers, and the urgency of the quarter. His voice was calm, commanding, every word clipped with the rhythm of someone who had mastered not just business, but people. If the Colorado Springs deal closes before the fiscal year ends, we're looking at a revenue increase of 7%. That means more leverage, more trust from the partners we need. Pens scratched, screens glowed with numbers, heads nodded in perfect rhythm. Jonathan's voice moved through the room like a conductor guiding an orchestra, and then his pen slipped from his fingers. At first, no one reacted. It was such a small thing, a pen falling from the hands of a man who always seemed in control. But then his jaw clenched, his breath caught, and for a split second, his sharp eyes lost their focus. His shoulders hunched forward, his posture buckled, and then like a tower crumbling without warning, Jonathan collapsed. The sound of his body hitting the polished floor split the silence like glass shattering. Chairs screeched back, papers rustled, a director let out a strangled gasp. "Jonathan." Another voice cracked. "Mr. Hale." Panic flooded the room in seconds. Men in tailored suits froze. Women in silk blouses clutched at their phones. But no one seemed to know what to do. The kind of paralysis that strikes when power itself falls at your feet. Except for one person, Sarah Whitmore. She was seated near the far end of the table, almost invisible as always. The secretary, the assistant, the one who made sure schedules aligned. Coffee was ordered, and meetings started on time. The one who rarely spoke in these rooms, and when she did, her words were clipped to practicality. But the moment Jonathan's body hit the ground, Sarah was already moving. Her heels clicked hard against the floor as she rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. One hand cupped his cheek, the other frantically sought his pulse. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry through the stunned silence of the boardroom. "Stay with me. Please, don't leave me. Not Mr. Hale, not Sir, but Jonathan." The intimacy in that name froze the room more than his collapse had. Sarah's emerald green dress brushed against the cold floor as she bent over him, her blazer slightly askew, her hair falling loose from the bun she'd tied that morning. She didn't care. Her eyes shone with something raw, something no one else in that room had ever seen directed at him. "Please, Jonathan," she murmured again, pressing her forehead against his temple for the briefest moment. Not like this. Not here. Not now. Around them, murmurs began. Disbelieving whispers darted from one end of the table to the other. Did she just wait? What's between them? She called him Jonathan. But no one finished their sentences. No one dared. The power in the room had shifted. The image of Jonathan Hale, the untouchable CEO, had cracked. And Sarah Whitmore, the woman they had always overlooked, now held the center of gravity in her hands. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Someone must have finally called for help. Yet Sarah didn't look up, didn't move from his side. Her thumb brushed across the line of his jaw, grounding him, grounding herself. For a flicker of a second, Jonathan stirred, his lips parted, a sound barely escaping. Sarah leaned closer, her tears threatening to spill. "I'm here," she whispered, voice breaking. "You're not alone." And in that fragile instant, before the paramedics stormed in, before the chaos fully erupted, the world shrank down to two people on the polished floor of a boardroom, a powerful man brought low, and the one person who refused to let go of him. It was not the collapse of a CEO. It was the unveiling of something no one had expected to see, something tender, something dangerous, something that would change everything. The morning had begun the way so many of Sarah Whitmore's mornings did, quiet, a little gray, and heavier than she wanted to admit. Her apartment sat on the edge of Denver's east side, where the city started to blur into the foothills. It was small, one bedroom, one bathroom, a kitchen that felt more like a hallway than a room, but it was hers. She had painted the walls a soft cream to fight the coldness of Colorado winters, and the carpet bore the familiar patterns of years of wear. That morning, the place smelled faintly of coffee, though the mug on her counter had already gone cold. She stood in her tiny bathroom, toothbrush dangling from her hand, staring at herself in the mirror, auburn strands of hair, unruly no matter how many times she smoothed them down. Caught the light. There were faint shadows under her eyes, a reminder of nights spent working too late or worrying too much. Her gaze slid to the corner of the mirror where she had tucked a photo years ago. A woman with kind eyes and a wide smile stood in Central Park, arms outstretched as though she could hug the entire world. Her mother, gone now, but not gone from Sarah's mornings. Behind the photo was a folded slip of paper she rarely let herself touch. This morning, though, her fingers reached for it. She unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases with care. 4 words. Written in Jonathan Hale's unmistakable hand, "You're stronger than you think." He had written it on an old note card 2 years ago, after a day when Sarah had been on the verge of quitting. She had been overwhelmed, humiliated by a careless remark from a director who treated her as little more than furniture. Jonathan had caught her in the hallway later, pressed the note into her hand, and said nothing else. Even now, she wasn't sure if he meant it as encouragement or simply observation. But she had kept it, tucked away behind her mother's photo, as if the two of them together could remind her to stand upright when the world felt too heavy. She traced the ink with her thumb, then folded it back up. A sigh slipped out before she could stop it. The truth was, she didn't want to go in that morning, not because of the work itself schedules, minutes, the endless tide of emails, but because of him, because of Jonathan. Sarah leaned against the bathroom counter, toothbrush forgotten, and let herself admit what she rarely said aloud: he made her life harder. Not because he was cruel, he wasn't. Jonathan Hale could be blunt, exacting, and distant. Yes, but never cruel. It was the opposite that unsettled her. The moments when he wasn't the CEO, the rare, unguarded glances, the times he remembered things, he had no reason to ask how she took her coffee, which earrings she wore most often, the day she skipped lunch. She admired him. She owed him more than she liked to admit. But admiration had a way of turning into something sharper, something that left her restless. And underneath it all was anger. Anger that he could see her so clearly one moment and then shut her out the next. It was a kind of push and pull that wore her down. Get it together. Sarah. She muttered to her reflection. She set the toothbrush down, rinsed her mouth, and tried again to tame her hair. Eventually, she gave up and twisted it into a simple bun. She applied a thin line of mascara, dabbed at her cheeks with a touch of blush, then stopped. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. You don't need to fix yourself to be enough. Sarah set the makeup brush down. Enough was a moving target these days. Back in the kitchen, she pulled a slice of bread from the bag and slid it into the toaster. While it browned, she slipped on her shoes, old flats, the leather worn thin at the toes. She glanced at the newer pair in the closet, still sitting in their box. She couldn't bring herself to wear them yet. Some things you saved for when life felt steadier. The toaster popped. She spread peanut butter across the bread, ate standing up, eyes fixed on the window where the city skyline rose against the pale morning sky. Denver was waking up. Buses hissed down the street. Neighbors shuffled out with dogs tugging at leashes. Life, ordinary and unremarkable, pressed on. And yet, Sarah felt the familiar knot in her stomach tighten. She knew what waited for her downtown. A building filled with people who dismissed her with polite smiles, who saw her as a piece of office furniture in a neat blazer, and at the center of it all, a man she couldn't seem to look at without feeling both steadied and unmoored. She slipped the folded note into her purse, tucked beside her badge. Her mother's photo stayed behind, smiling from the mirror. Sarah locked the door, walked down the creaky stairs, and stepped into the crisp morning air. As she made her way to the bus stop, she tried to shake the unease. She tried to tell herself that today would be like every other day. Meetings, memos, coffee that tasted faintly of cardboard, a quick laugh with someone from accounting, Jonathan passing by, nodding, barely acknowledging her. That was safer. That was what she expected. But as she clutched her purse tighter against her side, Sarah couldn't ignore the whisper that today would not be ordinary at all. And deep down, she already knew why her chest felt heavier, why her feet dragged just a little more. She wasn't just heading to a job. She was heading straight into the storm she had been pretending didn't exist. Downtown Denver always looked different in the morning. The rising sun caught the glass of the tallest towers and painted them gold, while the streets below churned with the shuffle of suits, the rhythm of heels, and the faint hum of traffic already impatient. At the center of it all stood the Hale & Co., building 42 floors of steel and glass, a monument to decades of ambition. And that morning, as the revolving doors spun open, Jonathan Hale stepped inside. He moved with the same quiet authority he always did, each stride purposeful, each glance sharp. To those watching the receptionist at the front desk, the interns waiting for elevators, he looked untouchable, as if nothing in the world could bend his spine or dull the edge in his eyes. But Sarah, trailing just a step behind, noticed what others didn't, the faint heaviness in his shoulders, the way his hand lingered a second too long on the briefcase strap, as if the weight wasn't only leather and paper. Jonathan Hale was tired. He would never say it. He would never show it. But Sarah had learned to see it in the small cracks, the subtle hesitation before he signed his name, the moments when his gaze drifted too long toward the window instead of the page in front of him. She had known him long enough to remember the rare glimpses when the armor slipped, like the morning he had appeared at her desk with a plain white paper bag, the smell of fresh coffee seeping through. "You don't like the machine in the break room," he had said simply, setting it down. She had blinked at him, surprised. "You went to Morning Finch. You hate that place." "I don't hate it," he'd replied, almost smiling. "I just dislike birds." It had been such a small thing, coffee, a lemon muffin folded into wax paper, but Sarah had carried that memory quietly, like a secret, or the afternoon he had paused in the hallway when she laughed at a coworker's clumsy joke. He hadn't joined the conversation, hadn't said a word, but she had caught him watching, his eyes soft in a way she rarely saw, before he turned sharply and walked on. He noticed things, always. The earrings she wore simple pearls, chipped a little at the edges. the days she forgot her lunch, the shoes she replaced too late. And yet, despite all those tiny acts of awareness, Jonathan Hale remained a man she could never quite reach. He lived behind a wall of polished words and precise gestures, a fortress of authority no one dared challenge. Now, as they walked side by side into the executive floor, Sarah forced herself back into her role. Clipboard in hand, schedule at the ready, her voice steady as she reminded him, "Your meeting with the board begins at 9. The updated projections are printed. I have confirmed the Singapore call for next week, and legal is waiting on your signature for the Zurich review." Jonathan gave a curt nod. "Thank you, Sarah." 2 words, polished, professional, and yet the timbre of his voice lingered with something unspoken. The conference room door opened, and the atmosphere shifted. Already, the directors were gathered. Men in tailored suits leaned against the table, murmuring in low tones. A few glanced at the spreadsheets glowing on their tablets. Others whispered about the morning headlines. The tension was sharp enough to taste. Sarah had grown used to that tension. Hale and Co. had weathered crises before, financial storms, market downturns, even scandals that had threatened to tarnish the family name. But this felt different, heavier. Whispers of a possible takeover had been circling for weeks. Anonymous reports, shifting numbers, investors suddenly hesitant. And though no one said it aloud, the fear beneath it all was clear. Jonathan Hale's grip on the company might not be as steady as it once was. He knew it. They all knew it. Jonathan took his seat at the head of the table, the chair carved from dark wood, positioned like a throne. He opened the folder in front of him, eyes scanning the numbers. His face revealed nothing, but Sarah saw the faint crease at his brow. One of the directors cleared his throat. "We'll need to discuss contingency plans." "Jonathan?" "If the merger doesn't go through," Jonathan raised a hand, silencing the room. "We're not here to speculate on failure," he said evenly. "We're here to strategize for success." His voice cut through the air like steel, and for a moment, even the murmurs stopped. Sarah sat near the corner, pen poised over her notepad. Though she knew she would remember every word without writing, her role was to listen, to record, to remain invisible. Yet she couldn't stop her eyes from drifting toward him. He looked unshakable, but she knew the truth. Behind the crisp lines of his suit, behind the polished cadence of his words, Jonathan Hale carried the weight of more than numbers. He carried the burden of trust, betrayal, and something far more dangerous than the boardroom realized. And Sarah, quiet, overlooked, Sarah was about to find herself standing closer to that burden than she ever imagined. The meeting had only just begun, but the storm was already at the door. The boardroom had its own kind of silence. It wasn't the comfortable stillness of a library or the soft hush of a church. It was heavier, dense, as though the weight of unspoken calculations and quiet betrayals pressed against the air itself. Jonathan Hale had been speaking with his usual precision. He leaned slightly forward, hands resting on the polished oak table, his gaze steady on the numbers projected on the screen. "If we close the Singapore deal by the 4th quarter," he was saying, his tone calm but firm. "We stabilize revenue projections by—" The pen in his hand slipped. It was such a small thing, barely noticeable. The pen clattered softly against the tabletop, rolling until it stopped near Sarah's notebook. She looked up just in time to see Jonathan's jaw tighten. His breath hitched sharp, uneven, then, like a tree struck at its core, his body folded, shoulders hunched, knees buckled, and before anyone could react, Jonathan Hale collapsed to the floor. The sound of his body hitting the carpeted wood was louder than it should have been. Chairs scraped back, a gasp cut through the air. A director muttered his name, voice cracking Jonathan. But no one moved, not at first. They were frozen, staring at the fallen man who had always seemed unshakable, the fortress of Hale and Co., now lying broken at their feet. Sarah moved. Her chair tipped back as she rushed forward, kneeling beside him. Her hand cupped his cheek, fingers trembling yet firm. His skin was clammy, his lips pale. She pressed her other hand to his wrist, searching for a pulse. "Jonathan," she whispered, "not Mr. Hale, not Sir, just Jonathan. The name slipped out before she could stop it, born of instinct, of something deeper than protocol. Please, her voice cracked, urgent. Stay with me. Don't leave me now. Her forehead brushed against his temple for the briefest moment. It was intimacy laid bare in a room that thrived on distance. Around her, the directors shifted uncomfortably. Murmurs broke through the silence. Did she just call him Jonathan? What's going on between them? Since when? No one finished their sentences. The questions hung in the air, thick and heavy, louder than the blare of the emergency call one of them finally made. But Sarah didn't care. Her world had narrowed to the man in front of her. She held his hand, refusing to let go even as others hovered with uncertainty. Time stretched strangely. The seconds between his collapse and the sound of sirens felt both endless and far too short. The double doors burst open, and paramedics swept in, their movements brisk, efficient. A gurney rolled forward. One of them crouched beside Sarah. "Ma'am, we'll take it from here." She shook her head. "I'm not leaving him." The paramedic hesitated, glancing at her, then at Jonathan's face, pale and unmoving. He nodded once. "Stay close. Hold his hand." And so she did. Even as they lifted Jonathan onto the stretcher, Sarah's fingers remained threaded through his. Even as the wheels squeaked against the polished floor, she kept her grip firm. She caught the look of one director, Mr. Lang, gray-haired, sharp-eyed as the stretcher rolled past. Suspicion flickered there, mingled with something else. Fear. Fear of what Jonathan's collapse meant for the company. Fear of what Sarah's whisper had revealed. The elevator doors slid shut on their faces, leaving Sarah alone with the paramedics and the steady, terrifying silence of Jonathan's still chest. "Stay with me," she whispered again, her voice steadier this time. And for the first time in her life, she didn't care who heard her. Hospitals had their own rhythm, one that never seemed to change. The steady beep of monitors, the hiss of oxygen, the shuffle of rubber-soled shoes on polished linoleum floors. To Sarah, it felt both sterile and suffocating, the air heavy with the sting of antiseptic. The lights so bright they left no room for shadows, no space to breathe. She sat in the corner of Jonathan's private room, a paper cup of tea cooling in her hands. Untouched. Hours had slipped by since they wheeled him in. The city outside kept moving, traffic lights cycling, buses sighing at their stops. But here, time had folded in on itself. Jonathan lay still beneath the crisp white sheets. His face, usually so composed, looked pale, almost unfamiliar. Without the armor of his suit and the command of his office, he seemed younger somehow, even vulnerable. Sarah found herself watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, as though memorizing the proof that he was still here. Her hand hadn't left his. At first, she had held it just to reassure herself, to anchor the moment, but the longer she sat, the more natural it felt. Her thumb traced small circles across his knuckles, the way one might calm a restless child. Her mind wandered back to the first time Jonathan had surprised her with kindness. She had been at Hale & Co., barely 6 months, when a project manager tried to pin a failed report on her. She had been called into a meeting, 3 executives staring her down, the word termination hanging in the air. Then Jonathan had walked in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply opened the file, pointed to the timestamp, and said, "That wasn't her mistake. It was mine. I'll handle it." The room had gone silent. No one dared contradict him. Sarah had been stunned not only because he had defended her, but because he had taken the blame himself. Later, when she tried to thank him, he brushed it off with a single sentence. "You were worth protecting." And there had been another night, one she never forgot. She had come back from lunch and sat at her desk, staring blankly at the computer screen. Everything in her life had felt like it was unraveling. Rent overdue, her mother's health failing, her own exhaustion pressing down like a weight she couldn't lift. Jonathan had passed by, paused, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he'd quietly asked, "Do you need 5 minutes? Or Do you need someone to listen? It was such a simple question, but it was the first time in months anyone had asked how she was instead of what she could do for them. He hadn't solved her problems, but he had sat in her office for 10 minutes, listening as she tried to untangle her own words. She hadn't cried, she hadn't broken down, but she had felt seen, and that had been enough. Now, sitting here in the too bright hospital room, Sarah realized those moments had never left her. They had shaped the space between them, quiet, invisible, but unshakable. A soft sound broke through her thoughts. Jonathan's fingers twitched beneath hers. His lips moved, faint and dry. Sarah leaned forward, her heart hammering. "Jonathan, I'm here. Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, the faint crease of pain crossing his forehead. His voice came rough, almost a whisper. "I never scheduled that meeting." Sarah froze. What he swallowed hard, his breath shallow. The board, Singapore. I didn't call it. Her mind spun. She had been the one to print the agenda that morning, to double-check the calendar. It had been there, stamped with his name, as official as anything else she had ever handled. "Jonathan, I don't understand." His eyes opened just enough to meet hers, hazy but intent. "Someone changed it, not me." The words landed heavy, pulling the air out of the room. Sarah sat back slowly, her grip tightening around his hand. A false meeting, a collapse in front of the board. And now, the first crack in the story, everyone thought they knew. She glanced at the monitors, at the door, at the faint shadows of nurses passing in the hallway. For the first time all day, the fear she felt wasn't only for Jonathan's health. It was for the truth he had just placed in her hands. And Sarah realized with a quiet shiver, his fall wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of something much larger. The hospital hallway was too cold, too still. Sarah stood outside Jonathan's room, stretching her legs after hours of sitting in the same chair. Her blazer hung loosely around her shoulders, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to the fabric. She rubbed her palms together, trying to summon warmth that wouldn't come. The elevator dinged, its doors sliding open with a low hiss. Out stepped a man who carried himself with the same height and broad frame as Jonathan, but none of the softness that Sarah had glimpsed in her employer. Michael Hale. He moved like the building belonged to him, steps precise, expression unreadable. His suit was darker than Jonathan's usual grays, almost black, and cut to accentuate his sharpness. His eyes, a colder shade of blue, scanned the hallway and landed squarely on Sarah. "You've been here all day," he said without preamble. His voice was low, clipped, as if conversation itself were a waste of time. Sarah straightened. I wasn't going to leave him alone. Michael's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "No, I don't imagine you would." For a moment, the hallway was filled only with the hum of fluorescent lights. Nurses passed, their carts rattling softly, but the space between Sarah and Michael felt suspended, heavy with things unsaid. Finally, he stepped closer. His gaze lingered on her hand, still faintly reddened from where she had clutched Jonathan's for hours. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore," Michael said, voice tightening. Why were you the only one he called by name before collapsing? The question cut sharper than she expected. Sarah felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but she held her ground. "Is that what this is about?" Michael's expression hardened. "There are whispers already. Board members talking." "You think they didn't notice the way you ran to him, like you cared, more than you should." The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because it twisted something genuine into suspicion. Her voice came before she could stop it, sharper than intended. "Because I did care." Michael blinked once, slowly, as though weighing the words. "So you admit it." "I admit nothing," Sarah shot back, her breath quickening. "Except that when a man collapses in front of me, I'm not going to stand by and watch him die." He studied her for a beat too long, his eyes narrowing. "Are you too involved?" Sarah's stomach twisted, but she didn't look away. "It's not like that." Michael stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Then, what is it? Gratitude, loyalty? Or something you think you can't name because it scares you? Her chest tightened. He was probing, not for truth, but for weakness. And she refused to give him either. You wouldn't understand, she said softly but firmly. Michael's expression flickered something between irritation and intrigue. Try me. Sarah drew in a steadying breath. Years ago, when no one else noticed I was drowning. Your brother did. He didn't have to. He could have let me fail. Instead, he gave me a reason to keep showing up. That's not involvement. Mr. Hale, that's humanity. For the first time, Michael's mask slipped, just slightly. His jaw clenched, his gaze cutting away for half a second before returning to her. And you think that gives you a seat beside his hospital bed? He asked coldly. No, Sarah whispered, her chin lifting. I don't think I have any seat. I wasn't supposed to matter, but I do. And maybe that scares you. The silence that followed was thick, weighted with something unspoken resentment, rivalry, and perhaps a touch of envy that Michael would never confess. He stepped back finally, smoothing his cufflink as though to erase the moment. His tone turned colder. Don't make this messy. Jonathan has a reputation to protect. Sarah's shoulders squared. So do I. The words left her mouth with surprising steadiness, surprising even herself. For years, she had been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed as just the secretary. Now, standing in front of Michael Hale, she realized she no longer needed to shrink. Michael's eyes lingered on her for one last moment, unreadable, before he turned and walked toward his brother's room. The echo of his polished shoes faded down the hall, leaving Sarah alone again. She exhaled slowly, her pulse finally steadying. Whatever Michael Hale wanted power, control, maybe even Jonathan's downfall, he would not get it by intimidating her. Not this time. The hospital cafeteria always smelled the same burnt toast, instant coffee, and the faint tang of disinfectant drifting down from the upper floors. Sarah sat by the window, her coat draped around her shoulders, a half-finished bowl of chicken noodle soup cooling in front of her. Outside, the rain traced tired patterns down the glass, the city's restless hum muffled by the storm. She had folded the napkin from her tray into a paper crane, the kind she used to make as a child, when the world felt too big to control. Its wings were small but open, fragile yet defiant. She set it beside her soup and sighed, trying to quiet the racing thoughts that hadn't left her since Jonathan's whispered words, "I never scheduled that meeting." The scrape of a chair pulled her back. "Didn't peg you for origami." Sarah looked up. Victoria Lang stood there tall, polished, immaculate. Her beige trench coat was spotless, her blonde hair twisted into a sleek knot, not a strand out of place. She looked like she had stepped out of a glossy magazine, untouched by rain or exhaustion. Sarah straightened instinctively. "Didn't peg you for hospital cafeterias?" Victoria's lips curved into a smile that showed teeth but no warmth. She sat down without asking, crossing her legs neatly. "I heard what happened. Poor Jonathan. Must be devastating for you." "I'm managing," Sarah said quietly, her fingers tightening around her paper cup of tea. Victoria leaned in, resting her chin on her hand. "You always were the strong, silent type, loyal to a fault, admirable, really, but dangerous in the wrong light." Sarah tilted her head, keeping her voice even. "What do you want?" "Victoria." "Oh, don't be so tense." Her voice dropped, silkier now, each word dripping with implication. "I just thought I'd check in. After all, companies don't run themselves. And if Jonathan is indisposed, well, some people might be wondering who's keeping the wheels turning." Sarah blinked. "Are you even still with the company?" Victoria's smile widened. "You'd be surprised how many people return when things get interesting." There it was, the gleam in her eyes, sharp as glass. She wasn't here by accident. She had come to be seen, to remind Sarah of her place. "You're wasting your time," Sarah said softly, pushing the soup aside. Victoria leaned forward, her perfume sharp, calculated. "Am I? Because from where I'm sitting, you're still just the secretary. And you might want to be careful with the way people see you now. You don't know who's watching. The words landed like a blade laid flat on the table, not cutting yet, but promising to. Sarah met her gaze without flinching. Jonathan trusts me? Victoria's smile faltered, though only slightly. Her eyes, however, turned cold. Jonathan has always had a weakness for women who make him feel seen. It doesn't mean you're special. It just means he's lonely. That cut deeper than Sarah expected. For a moment, she felt the old instinct to shrink, to swallow her words and look away. But she didn't. Maybe, she said evenly. But I'm not the one who came back the moment the crown slipped. Silence stretched between them, taut as wire. Victoria's jaw tightened, but she smoothed it over with another perfect smile. She stood, adjusting her coat with a flick of her wrist. Be careful, Sarah. Wars are never won by sentiment. And make no mistake, this is a war. Sarah remained seated, her expression calm, even as her chest thudded with the weight of the encounter. She reached for the small paper crane, studied its folded wings for a moment, then placed it carefully in the center of the table. When she finally stood to leave, she didn't look back. The crane sat between the empty bowls and coffee cups, fragile but unyielding. And somehow, it felt like the truest answer she could have given. The storm had finally broken outside the hospital. Rain streaked across the wide windows of Jonathan's private room, leaving faint trails that glittered under the streetlights. The city hummed faintly in the distance, but in here, everything was still save for the low, steady beep of the heart monitor. Jonathan had woken hours earlier. His strength was returning slowly, but his eyes held the same sharpness Sarah remembered from the boardroom. And yet, there was something different now, an openness, a quiet resolve, as though nearly losing everything had stripped away the last of his walls. He shifted slightly against the pillows, grimacing at the stiffness in his body. Sarah rose from the chair where she had been keeping vigil and moved to steady him. You shouldn't sit up so quickly, she said softly. He gave a faint smile. I've never been good at staying still. Her lips curved, but worry still shadowed her features. You need rest, Jonathan. The company can wait. His gaze met hers, steady and intent. That's the thing. Sarah. The company isn't what I'm worried about. Before she could reply, he reached beneath the blanket, fumbling for something near the bedside drawer. With effort, he pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, its edges worn. The black cover creased from years of use. On top of it lay a key simple silver, dulled from handling. He extended them toward her. These are for you. Sarah blinked, startled. Jonathan. What is this? His expression didn't waver. Insurance, proof, and maybe a confession. Hesitantly, she took the key and the notebook. The leather was warm from his touch. She sat back down, opening the cover with care. Inside, page after page of Jonathan's handwriting filled the margin sharp strokes, rush scrawls, some almost illegible, others underlined twice. Her eyes scanned the first entry's dates, names, shorthand notes. ML blocked the Zurich deal, claimed oversight, intentional. Another VL private dinner with Sims. Rumors planted about Q3 losses. Michael, Victoria, both written again and again. Their initials a map of sabotage stretching back months, maybe years. Every page revealed another instance where they had twisted decisions, bent rules, planted doubts. Sarah's pulse quickened. This wasn't paranoia. It was evidence. She turned another page, her breath catching when she saw her own name, written clearly, underlined once, but different from the others. She's the only one I trust. Her fingers froze on the paper. The room seemed to tilt, the hum of the machines fading beneath the weight of those words. Jonathan, she whispered. He looked at her then, really looked, his blue eyes raw in a way she had never seen. I didn't mean for you to find that, he said quietly. Not like this. She swallowed hard, her voice barely steady. You wrote it down. That has to mean something. Jonathan exhaled, long and weary. He turned his gaze toward the rain-streaked window, his profile etched with fatigue and something heavier. Do you know what it's like to be surrounded by people who share your blood, your history, your empire, and still feel completely alone? Sarah didn't answer. She knew he wasn't asking her for words. My brother, he continued, voice low, has spent years waiting for me to stumble. Victoria. She was supposed to be a partner once. Instead, she learned how to turn trust into leverage. Every time I let them close, I paid for it. His hand tightened faintly on the blanket. So, I stopped letting anyone close at all. He fell silent, the words hanging heavy in the sterile air. Sarah studied him, the man who had stood like marble in the boardroom, who had built an empire with his precision, his relentlessness. And here he was now, stripped of everything but truth. She closed the notebook slowly, holding it against her chest. And yet, you handed this to me. His gaze returned to hers, steady, unwavering, because you've seen me fall, Sarah, and you didn't look away. Her throat tightened, her mind still caught on the words in his notebook. She's the only one I trust. She wanted to ask what that trust meant, whether it was duty, friendship, or something far more fragile and dangerous. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she set the notebook carefully on the table beside the untouched hospital water and folded her hands over his. Whatever this is, whatever they've done, you don't have to face it alone anymore. For the first time since she had known him, Jonathan Hale let his shoulders drop. He closed his eyes briefly, as though finally allowing himself to believe it. The storm outside pressed on, but inside that hospital room, a fragile alliance had been sealed not with signatures or contracts, but with a notebook, a key, and the quiet promise of trust. The hospital had quieted by evening. Visitors trickled out, leaving behind the low murmur of nurses' voices and the rhythmic beeping of machines. Jonathan had drifted into a restless sleep, his breathing uneven but steady enough to calm Sarah's heart. She sat by the window, watching droplets slide down the glass, each one catching a fragment of the streetlight outside. The notebook lay on the table, closed but heavy with meaning. The key glimmered faintly beside it. Sarah rubbed her hands together, restless. Something about Jonathan's earlier words lingered in her mind, his loneliness, his trust. Her eyes drifted to the small drawer in the bedside table, the one he had reached into before. Curiosity pressed against her chest like a pulse. She hesitated. It wasn't hers to open. But something told her that whatever Jonathan kept there wasn't just for him anymore. Slowly, carefully, she slid the drawer open. Inside lay a small velvet box, its corners worn. The deep navy fabric faded with age. It wasn't large, barely the size of her palm, but it carried the kind of weight that made her breath catch. She lifted it out, feeling the texture of the cloth beneath her fingers. It was heavier than it looked, the kind of box meant to hold more than just objects, meant to hold meaning. Sarah opened it. Inside, folded carefully, was a piece of cream-colored linen, edges frayed, softened by time. Nestled within it was a photograph, old and slightly yellowed. Her breath caught. Jonathan, much younger, maybe 17, stood stiffly in a suit that looked borrowed, the sleeves just a little too long. His features were sharper, not yet hardened by the boardroom, but his eyes were unmistakable. Beside him stood a woman with warm, elegant features, her hand clasping his. She radiated the kind of presence that felt both commanding and tender. His mother. On the back of the photo, written in careful, slanted handwriting, were the words, "If he forgets who he is, remind him." Sarah's vision blurred. She blinked quickly, but the tears slipped free anyway. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to steady herself. Her gaze moved to the folded linen. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it to find a letter, the paper yellowed but still intact. She read slowly, her lips moving with the words, "My son, one day, they will ask you to choose between what you can take and what you can give. I hope you choose the latter, even if it breaks your heart, because love is not weakness. Love is the only thing that keeps power from becoming poison. If you forget who you are, if they pull you too far from yourself, look for the one who stays when the rest have left. She will know how to bring you home. Mom Sarah lowered the letter into her lap, tears spilling freely now. The hospital room blurred around her. She thought of Jonathan, the fortress he had built around himself, the way he carried his company like a burden, the way he trusted no one, not even his own blood. And yet, he had trusted her, not because she was clever, not because she was ambitious, but because she had stayed. Her heart ached with the realization. His mother's words weren't just a hope scribbled in ink decades ago. They were a prophecy he had unknowingly fulfilled. Sarah pressed the photograph to her chest, whispering softly into the stillness, "I'll remind him? I promise." She looked at Jonathan, asleep but restless, his brow furrowed as though even dreams offered no refuge. She thought of the boy in the photograph, awkward in his too large suit, holding tightly to his mother's hand. She thought of the man now, fighting to hold on to everything while being slowly betrayed by those closest to him. And she understood, with a clarity that shook her, why he had chosen her. It wasn't about her skills as a secretary. It wasn't about loyalty born of hierarchy. It was because she was the one who had stayed when it was easier to walk away. The velvet box lay open on the table now. The letter and photograph spread before her like fragile truths. Sarah wiped her cheeks, her resolve settling in. This wasn't just about Jonathan's survival. It was about reminding him of who he was meant to be, not the untouchable CEO, not the weary strategist, but the man who once believed love could keep power from rotting. And Sarah knew, with every beat of her heart, that she had just stepped into a role larger than anything she had ever imagined. Not his assistant, not even his confidant. She was the one his mother had spoken of, the one who would bring him home. The 42nd floor of Hale & Co. had never felt so tense. The boardroom, normally a stage for polished speeches and careful strategy, now carried the air of a battlefield. The mahogany table gleamed under the recessed lights, a place where fortunes were made and legacies destroyed. Michael Hale stood at the head of the table, tall, composed, his suit immaculate. He carried himself like he had already won, his words smooth, practiced, almost hypnotic. Beside him, Victoria Lang was elegance embodied, her pearl earrings glinting as she poured coffee into a porcelain cup. She smiled at the directors, every inch the ally they thought they needed, and with Jonathan's health uncertain, Michael was saying, the board must consider stability, continuity. Hale & Co. cannot afford hesitation in times of transition. Several directors nodded gravely. Papers rustled. The scent of expensive cologne and fresh espresso mingled with tension thick enough to choke. Then the doors opened. Sarah Whitmore stepped inside. Every head turned. Some looked surprised, others annoyed. Michael's expression barely flickered, but Victoria's smile sharpened, a thin line that did not reach her eyes. "Miss Whitmore," Michael said smoothly. "This is a closed session." Sarah didn't flinch. Her heels clicked steadily against the polished floor as she walked toward the table. In her hand was a small flash drive. She placed it at the center of the table, her voice calm but clear. "In the interest of transparency," she said, "I thought the board might want to see what actually happened before making any decisions." A murmur rippled through the room. One director leaned forward. "What's on it?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "The truth, pulled directly from your own security cameras." Victoria's hand tightened imperceptibly around her coffee cup. Michael's eyes narrowed. "And you expect us to take your word for it?" "No," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "I expect you to watch it." The silence was taut, every second dragging. Finally, Mrs. Everett, one of the oldest board members, her silver hair gleaming beneath the lights, gestured to the IT assistant at the side of the room. "Play it." The assistant inserted the drive into the laptop connected to the large screen. The footage flickered to life. 7:51 a.m. The boardroom was empty, chairs neatly arranged, the long table bare save for a few bottles of water. 7:52 a.m. The door opened. Victoria Lang entered. The air in the room shifted instantly. Directors leaned forward. Michael's jaw tensed, though he kept his face otherwise impassive. On screen, Victoria walked confidently to Jonathan's chair at the head of the table. She set her designer bag down, removed a phone, and tapped quickly. She scrolled, opened the calendar app, and typed. Her movements were practiced, efficient, without hesitation. She confirmed the Singapore meeting, then slid the phone back into Jonathan's coat pocket, smoothing it as though nothing had happened. 7:53 a.m. She left the room. The footage ended. Silence. It was so complete, so suffocating, that Sarah could hear her own pulse in her ears. Finally, one of the directors spoke, his voice rough. "That's Jonathan's phone." Another director added, "She had his passcode." Victoria set down her cup with deliberate care, her smile still intact, though her eyes flashed with steel. "This proves nothing. An administrative mistake at best. Hardly grounds for Mrs. Everett cut her off, her voice sharp. "It proves deliberate manipulation. It proves intent." Michael cleared his throat, his composure fraying just slightly. "We should not rush to conclusions based on—" "Do you deny knowledge of this?" another director interrupted. Michael's lips tightened. "I had no part in the scheduling of that meeting." His gaze slid toward Victoria, then back to the table. "And I certainly did not instruct Miss Lang to—" "She doesn't need instruction," Sarah said quietly, but firmly. All eyes turned to her. She clasped her hands in front of her, steady despite the pounding in her chest. Victoria has always known how to play her part. Whisper doubts, plant seeds, shift the ground beneath people's feet until they fall. And while Jonathan was fighting to hold this company together, you— She looked directly at Michael, were waiting for him to stumble. The words landed like blows. Michael's expression darkened, but before he could reply, "Mrs." Everett leaned forward, her gaze sweeping the room. "I move that we suspend the vote until further review of this footage. We cannot make a decision with evidence of deliberate deception staring us in the face." A murmur of agreement spread around the table. Michael pressed his lips into a thin line. Victoria sat rigid, her nails digging into her porcelain cup, the faintest crack running down its side. Sarah stood tall, her breath steady. For the first time, she saw the cracks in their control, not in Jonathan, but in them. And she realized that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the room wasn't influence, or wealth, or legacy. It was truth. The boardroom still hummed with shock, the air thick with tension after the footage had ended. Directors whispered in low voices, some scribbling notes, others simply staring at Victoria, who sat rigid, porcelain cup cracked in her grip. Michael's jaw had clenched so tightly the muscles in his neck trembled. Sarah stood quietly at the far end of the table, her palms pressed against the cool surface. For the first time since Jonathan had collapsed, she felt as if she had struck back at the storm that had been consuming them. The truth had broken through their performance. But then Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced down, expression unreadable. His thumb moved quickly, then he looked up, eyes narrowing at Sarah. Moments later, one of the IT staff slipped into the room, whispering something into Mrs. Everett's ear and sliding a printed page onto the table. The elderly director adjusted her glasses, her brow furrowing deeply. "What is it?" another board member asked. "Mrs." Everett looked at Sarah, then back at the page. Her voice, though calm, carried a weight that made the entire room still. An anonymous email was received just now by the board's compliance office. It includes server logs, suggesting that the calendar entry wasn't only created by Miss Lang. Sarah's stomach dropped. Mrs. Everett laid the page flat for all to see. Rows of data, timestamps, IP addresses. Her finger tapped one line in particular. It came from a system with access credentials tied to David Clark. The room seemed to tilt. David, the cheerful HR director, the man who always brought donuts on Fridays, who covered for Sarah when she left early to care for her sick neighbor, who slipped extra sugar packets into her coffee with a grin. He had been a friend, an ally. Her breath caught. "That's impossible," she whispered, barely trusting her voice. Michael seized the moment, leaning forward. Or perhaps not so impossible. Loyalty is rarely as pure as it looks. Victoria's smile returned, faint but sharp. "It seems you've been looking in the wrong direction. Sarah?" Her knees threatened to give way, but she forced herself upright. The betrayal cut deeper than any corporate maneuver. This wasn't a rival scheming in the open. It was someone who had stood beside her in the everyday. Someone who had laughed with her in the break room. The directors exchanged glances, their earlier certainty shaken. "Mrs. Everett spoke again. "We'll need to investigate further before drawing conclusions, but the logs appear authentic." Sarah's mind spun. She remembered the mornings David brought her croissants, joking about how she needed more sweetness in her life. The afternoons he lingered by her desk, asking about her weekend plans. His quiet reassurance when whispers about Jonathan's harshness grew too loud. All of it felt different now. Each memory reframed as something else: surveillance, manipulation, positioning. Michael's voice sliced through her thoughts. "Perhaps, Miss Whitmore, your judgment isn't as sound as you believe. If you couldn't see betrayal standing right beside you, how can you expect this board to trust your accusations now?" Her fists tightened at her sides. She wanted to shout, to deny it, but the evidence on the paper glared back at her. Cold, clinical, unforgiving. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Then she remembered Jonathan's words at the hospital. "You see everything." No, she told herself firmly. This wasn't the end. She raised her chin, her voice steady despite the quiver in her chest. "If David Clark is involved, then you should be asking yourselves who gave him cover, who stood to gain from his access. Because betrayal rarely walks alone." The directors murmured again, some nodding slowly. Michael's eyes flickered, just enough for Sarah to see it, the shadow of unease he couldn't quite hide. Victoria sipped from her cracked cup, her lipstick staining the rim. "Careful, dear," she purred. "The more you chase ghosts, the easier it is to become one yourself." But Sarah didn't flinch. Beneath her pain, something hard and clear crystallized. David had fooled her. Yes, he had betrayed her kindness, her trust. But that didn't erase the truth she carried. It didn't erase Jonathan's faith in her. She gathered the papers into her hands, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Investigate him. Investigate all of them. But don't mistake betrayal for weakness. Sometimes the wound is what teaches you where the poison really lies." The room fell silent again. "Mrs. Everett studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "We will reconvene after a recess. There is more here than what meets the eye." Sarah stepped back, her pulse hammering, her chest tight. As the directors filed out in hushed tones, Michael shot her one last look, a smile without warmth. A warning wrapped in silk. She didn't care. Not anymore. Because now she knew the knife in her back hadn't come from the enemies she expected. It had come from the friend who smiled too easily, who walked too close, who hid behind kindness. And somehow, that hurt more than all the rest. The boardroom had emptied for recess, but the tension lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Sarah lingered near the window, her reflection pale against the glass. The skyline of Denver stretched out before her, steel and glass towers glowing in the evening light. Yet her chest was tight with something far more intimate than corporate politics. Behind her, the sound of footsteps echoed across the polished floor. Michael Hale. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. His presence carried the same weight as his brother's, but twisted sharper, colder, less certain. "You've made quite the spectacle," he said, his tone measured but laced with disdain. Sarah turned slowly, meeting his gaze. His suit was still immaculate, his posture rigid, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something brittle. "It wasn't a spectacle," she replied. Her voice was steady, even though her heart pounded. "It was the truth, and truth doesn't need spectacle." Michael stepped closer, his jaw tightening. You think you've exposed me? All you've done is reveal how naive you really are. People like David Clark, people like Victoria, they don't act alone. They never do." Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "Exactly. Which is why I asked the board to look deeper." His lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You speak with conviction, Miss Whitmore. But conviction doesn't change the fact that you trusted the wrong man. You handed him your confidence, and he gutted you with it." Her hands clenched at her sides, but she didn't look away. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "Betrayal never knocks. Michael, it slips in through the door you thought was safe." The words landed harder than she expected. His composure faltered. For a moment, Michael looked not like the polished executive who had just tried to seize his brother's legacy, but like a man caught between shadows, between anger and regret, pride and doubt. His gaze flickered toward the empty chair at the head of the table. "My whole life," he murmured, almost to himself. "I was the second son. Jonathan was the star, the prodigy, the leader, the one everyone trusted without question. And me, I was the afterthought, the one they humored, the one they tolerated." Sarah softened, just slightly. She hadn't expected him to speak so plainly. "You didn't have to be his shadow," she said gently. "You chose to make yourself one." He bristled, anger flashing in his eyes. "You don't know what it's like to be compared to him every day, to watch your own blood succeed while you scrape for recognition." "I built my name in the margins he left behind." Sarah held his gaze, refusing to retreat. "And now, you've let Victoria turn your resentment into her weapon. She doesn't see you as a partner, Michael. She sees you as leverage." The words struck something raw. His jaw twitched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. For the first time, doubt flickered openly across his face. She needed access. Sarah continued, her tone firm but not cruel. She needed someone inside the family to validate her schemes. "And you," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "you were angry enough, wounded enough, to let her use you?" He turned away sharply, pacing toward the far wall. His reflection in the glass looked smaller than the man who had commanded the table minutes before. "You think Jonathan hasn't used people he snapped?" His voice harsher now, defensive. "He's built an empire on loyalty he never earned. He doesn't deserve the pedestal everyone puts him on." "Maybe not," Sarah said quietly, "but he never used me. He trusted me. And there's a difference." Michael stopped pacing, his shoulders rigid. For a long moment, silence filled the room. When he turned back, his eyes were conflicted storm clouds fighting with sunlight. "Do you have any idea what it's like to love and hate someone at the same time? To want their approval and their downfall in the same breath?" Sarah's chest tightened. She saw him differently now, not just as an antagonist, but as a man drowning in contradictions. "I think," she said softly, "you've spent so long trying to prove you're not your brother that you never stop to ask who you really are." The words seemed to cut through him. His expression faltered, anger draining into something more fragile, more human. For the briefest moment, Michael looked lost, but then the mask slipped back into place. His spine straightened, his voice sharpened. "Don't think for a second this means I'm finished. Jonathan may have you whispering truths into his ear, but I'm not the one you should pity, Miss Whitmore, because when the dust settles, you'll realize the only thing more dangerous than betrayal." His eyes narrowed, is misplaced faith. He brushed past her, his footsteps echoing as he left the boardroom. Sarah stood rooted in place, her breath uneven, her mind reeling. She had seen something in him, a fracture, a glimpse of the boy who had grown up in his brother's shadow. But she had also seen the danger of a man unwilling to let go of his resentment. For all his polished armor, Michael Hale was bleeding inside. And Sarah knew one truth with chilling clarity: wounded men wielded the sharpest knives. The atmosphere on the 42nd floor had shifted. Word spread like wildfire. Jonathan Hale was coming back. Not on a stretcher, not in whispers of weakness, but walking dressed, steady, alive. Sarah stood near the elevator, her heart pounding as the metallic doors slid open. And there he was. Jonathan stepped out, clad in his charcoal gray suit, freshly pressed, his tie straight, his shoes polished to a shine. He looked taller somehow, his posture unyielding despite the paleness that lingered in his face. Every eye in the corridor turned to him, whispers rippling like waves. "Mr. Hale," someone started. "Jonathan," he corrected softly. Without breaking stride, his pace was measured, but every step felt like a declaration. Sarah walked beside him, their shoulders almost brushing. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. When they reached the boardroom doors, the air inside was taut with unease. Michael stood at the head of the table again, his jaw tight, while Victoria lounged in her seat, her smile poised like a blade. The directors turned as Jonathan entered, and the room went silent. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood at the far end of the table, letting the quiet settle until it pressed against every chest. His gaze swept across the room, steady and sharp, before finally resting on the empty chair meant for him. "I'm not going to spend the next 10 minutes defending who I am," he began, his voice clear and resonant. "If you don't know what I stand for by now, then you haven't been paying attention." No one moved. Even Michael's expression wavered, just slightly. Jonathan's hand rested lightly on the back of his chair, but he didn't sit. "For years, I believed legacy was something you built in silence. That dignity meant never letting them see what it cost to hold the line. I thought strength was measured by how much you could endure without showing the cracks." His voice softened, but the room leaned closer. "I was wrong." The words hung heavy, unexpected. "Legacy isn't built in silence." Jonathan continued, his gaze sweeping over the directors. "It's built when you let them see what it costs, when you allow them to understand the sacrifices, the pain, the humanity behind the numbers. It's not about appearing unbreakable, it's about showing that you can break and still choose to stand again." Sarah felt her throat tighten. He wasn't just speaking to the board. He was speaking to everyone who had ever carried weight in secret, everyone who had ever been told vulnerability was weakness. Jonathan turned his gaze briefly toward her, and she saw it the glimmer of truth, of gratitude, of something more. "I won't hide behind perfection anymore," he said firmly, "and I won't allow deceit, betrayal, or ambition dressed as loyalty to decide the future of this company." All eyes flicked toward Victoria. Her smile faltered, just barely. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mrs.?" Everett leaned forward, her voice breaking the silence. "Shall we put it to a vote?" The board members exchanged glances, tension thick as storm clouds. Then, one by one, hands began to rise. First, Mrs. Everett, then Mr. Simmons, then two more, then another. The momentum was unstoppable. When the final count was called, it was clear Jonathan Hale would remain as CEO. Relief washed over Sarah, though she kept her face composed. Jonathan inclined his head slightly. "Thank you." Across the table, Victoria stood abruptly. The scrape of her chair against the polished floor was sharp as a blade. "Well," she said coolly, slipping her coat over her shoulders, "it seems the board has made its choice. I hope you all enjoy the storm that follows." Her heels clicked as she strode to the door, her smile brittle now, her eyes burning. When she passed Sarah, she paused just long enough to murmur, "This isn't over, darling." Sarah met her gaze, calm and unyielding. "No, but your part is." Victoria's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. She swept out, the door closing behind her with a decisive thud. Michael remained seated, staring at the table, his knuckles white against the polished wood. For once, he didn't speak. Jonathan finally lowered himself into the chair at the head of the table. The directors watched in silence as he leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "This company was never meant to be a throne," he said quietly. "It was meant to be a legacy worth sharing, and starting today. That's exactly what will make it." The words didn't thunder. They didn't need to. They landed like stone solid, undeniable, unforgettable. Sarah exhaled slowly, her her chest swelling with something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. The penthouse was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that feels earned after a storm. From the wide windows, Denver's skyline glittered in the darkness, lights pulsing like a heartbeat across the horizon. Sarah sat curled on the window seat, her legs tucked beneath her, a mug of chamomile tea warming her hands. She wore one of her older sweaters, the hem slightly frayed, but it was soft and familiar. The faint hum of the city below reminded her that life went on, even when hers felt suspended in this fragile bubble of silence. Behind her, Jonathan moved slowly about the kitchen. He'd rolled his sleeves to his forearms, the lines of his shirt relaxed, his tie gone. He looked less like the CEO of Hale & Co. and more like the man Sarah had glimpsed in rare, unguarded moments. A man who brewed tea instead of barking orders. A man who remembered she liked lemon slices in her cup. He crossed the room with careful steps, carrying his own mug. When he sat beside her on the window seat, their knees brushed lightly, neither pulled away. For a while, they simply sat together, watching the city through the glass, steam curling from their cups. The silence wasn't awkward. It was full of everything left unsaid, everything carried in glances and gestures too delicate to name. At last, Jonathan spoke. His voice was lower than usual, quieter, stripped of the sharpness it carried in the boardroom. "I pushed you away," he said slowly, "because you were the only part of my life I didn't know how to protect." Sarah turned her head, startled. His eyes were fixed on the skyline, but she could see the weight in them, the truth dragging against his chest. He continued, words steady but heavy. "Everything else I could control. Numbers, contracts, rivals, even Michael. I could fight them, outthink them, outlast them. But you," his jaw tightened, his hand curling around his mug. "With you, I couldn't. You mattered too much. And the more you mattered, the more certain I became that one day I'd lose you." Sarah's throat tightened. She wanted to answer, but for a moment, she couldn't find words. He finally turned, his gaze meeting hers. There was no armor now, no polished CEO mask, just Jonathan, a man laid bare. "I thought," he said softly, "if I made you believe you were only my secretary, then maybe you'd be safe. Maybe I could keep you out of the fire." Her eyes stung, but she managed a faint smile. "And how did that work out for you?" For the first time that night, he laughed quiet, self-deprecating. "Terribly." Sarah set her tea aside and placed her hand over his. His skin was warm, his grip instinctively tightening around her fingers. "You don't need to protect me, Jonathan," she said gently. "I'm not here to fix you. I'm here because I see you. The way your mother saw you, the way you've tried so hard not to let anyone else." His eyes softened, and he leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers. She could feel his breath, unsteady but honest. "I'm so tired," he whispered. "Tired of pretending I don't feel anything." "You don't have to pretend with me," she murmured. For a long, fragile moment, neither moved. The world outside seemed to fade the city noise, the hum of the building, even the restless beat of their fears. All that remained was the closeness between them, the warmth of skin against skin, the truth they had run from for too long. When he finally kissed her, it wasn't hurried, it wasn't desperate, it was slow, honest. The kind of kiss that didn't demand, didn't consume. The kind that said, "I'm here, I see you, I'm not leaving." Sarah felt her chest ache as she leaned into him, her hand sliding gently against his jaw. His lips were warm, unguarded, carrying the weight of years spent building walls and the relief of finally letting them fall. When they pulled apart, there were no grand declarations, no dramatic promises, just silence, tender and full. Jonathan exhaled, a faint tremor in his breath. "I've built an empire, Sarah. But tonight, this is hand tightened around hers. This feels like the only thing that matters." She smiled softly, resting her head against his shoulder. Maybe that's the point. They sat like that for a long time, the city lights flickering around them. The storm had passed, but both knew there were battles yet to come. Still, in that quiet night, they allowed themselves to be two people, not CEO and secretary, not guardian and confidant, just Jonathan and Sarah, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The city never truly slept, even at 2 a.m. The streets below Jonathan's penthouse buzzed faintly with late-night taxis, neon signs, and the occasional hum of sirens in the distance. But Sarah hadn't heard any of it. Her phone vibrated against the glass coffee table, a sharp interruption to the fragile peace she had carried back from Jonathan's embrace. She reached for it, weary, her hands trembling slightly. The message was from an unknown number. No words, only an image. Her stomach twisted. The grainy security still showed David Clark. His easy smile was frozen mid-step as he slipped out of Jonathan's private office. In his hand glinted a key card, Jonathan's master access. The timestamp in the corner was damning 2 weeks before Jonathan's collapse. Sarah's chest constricted, the air refusing to come. She pressed a hand to her lips, her mind racing. David, the man who had brought her coffee with cream when he knew she hated it black. The man who teased her about her scuffed shoes, who dropped donuts on her desk like small acts of kindness. The man who always seemed to know when she was struggling. And all this time, he had been slipping knives between her ribs. Sarah sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the photo until the edges blurred with tears. What was she supposed to do with this? Her first instinct screamed, go public. Forward it to compliance, to the board, to the press if she had to. Expose him, tear away the mask, end it here and now. But another voice whispered, what would that accomplish? Would the truth cleanse the company or burn it down completely? Would Jonathan survive another scandal, another betrayal laid bare in front of the world? She dropped her head into her hands. Sleep was impossible. Her mind replayed every memory of David, his laughter, his casual loyalty, the way he had always made her feel like she wasn't alone. Was any of it real, or had it all been a long game by dawn? Her decision crystallized. She wouldn't go public. Not yet. Not until she understood the full picture. Instead, she slipped the printed still into a manila folder, along with the access log she had quietly pulled from the system. The paper felt heavier than lead. When the office lights flickered on that morning, Sarah didn't go to her desk. She walked straight past the receptionists and assistants, past the curious glances and whispered speculation, until she stood outside Michael Hale's office. Her knuckles hovered at the door for a heartbeat. Then she knocked once and entered. Michael looked up, surprised. His suit jacket hung on the back of his chair. His tie loosened. He had clearly been there all night, the weight of the board's decision still pressing against him. Miss Whitmore, he said slowly, his voice rough. I thought you'd be at your desk or with my brother. Sarah stepped forward and placed the folder on his desk. This isn't about Jonathan. It's about you. He raised an eyebrow, wary, and flipped the folder open. His eyes scanned the contents, the logs, the still image. For the first time since she had known him, Michael Hale's composure cracked completely. His lips parted, then closed again. His brow furrowed, his jaw clenched. He read every line twice, his fingers tightening on the edge of the paper. Finally, he looked up at her, and for a long moment, there was no disdain in his eyes, only something raw. You could have destroyed me, he said quietly. His voice carried none of the polished arrogance she had come to expect. It was stripped bare, vulnerable. This would have finished me. Sarah crossed her arms, her own voice steady. I didn't bring it to the board. I didn't leak it. I brought it here, to you. He shook his head slowly, disbelief flickering across his features. Why after everything? Why give me the chance to even speak? Because destruction isn't the same as justice, Sarah said softly. And because I think you've been used just as much as I have. David, Victoria, they played both sides. You thought you were pulling the strings, but you were just another piece on the board." Michael leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words pressing against him. His hand covered his mouth as he stared at the evidence again. For the first time, Sarah saw him not as Jonathan's rival or a polished manipulator, but as a man blindsided, betrayed by people he believed in, the same way she had been. "You're right," he admitted, his voice low, almost breaking. "Victoria told me David was loyal, that he was feeding her harmless information, nothing serious. She said I could use him to get close to Jonathan's circle. God." He pressed a hand against his temple. "I let her convince me I was finally in control. And all the while, she was the one pulling every string." Sarah didn't answer. She just stood there, watching as the weight of betrayal pressed down on him the way it had crushed her hours earlier. At last. Michael looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "You could have destroyed me," he repeated, softer this time, "but you chose not to." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not here to destroy you, Michael. I'm here to stop this cycle. Betrayal after betrayal, power games that leave nothing but ruin. If you want to survive this, you'll need to decide who you're really fighting for. Because if it's still just about beating your brother, then you've already lost." His eyes darkened, but it wasn't with anger. It was with the weight of truth. For the first time, Michael Hale was silent. Truly silent. Sarah turned to leave, her hand on the door. She paused just long enough to add, "Think about it, because one day soon, the board won't care about excuses. They'll only care about who still has the courage to stand." And with that, she stepped out, the folder still lying open on his desk, the damning image of David Clark frozen mid-betrayal staring back at him. Behind her. Michael exhaled shakily, his head dropping into his hands. The long game wasn't over, but the pieces on the board were shifting. The days that followed were unlike any Hale & Co. had seen in its long history. The chaos of the boardroom showdown gave way to something unexpected clarity. Jonathan Hale returned to his office not as a man clawing back control, but as one who had decided to lead differently. The walls that once felt like marble fortresses seemed lighter, the closed doors opening more often than they had in years. The first order of business wasn't a new acquisition or a press release. It was a meeting with every department head, every manager who had kept the company running through whispers and uncertainty. Jonathan stood before them in the glass atrium, sunlight catching the silver at his temples, his voice steady. "This company is not a crown," he told them. "It is not a fortress, nor a prize to be fought over. Hale & Co. was built to serve, not to conquer, and from this day forward, I will not ask you to follow me in silence. I will ask you to walk beside me in truth, in transparency, in the kind of integrity that cannot be shaken by rumor or ambition." The words carried through the space like a vow. For the first time, his employees didn't just see their CEO, they saw a man willing to show the cost of carrying the weight. And standing just a few feet away, Sarah felt her chest tighten. She had watched him at his lowest on the boardroom floor, on a hospital bed, in the quiet of his penthouse. And now, she was watching him rise not as a marble figure of authority, but as someone who finally understood that legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was written in the lives of the people who believed in you. Later that week, the announcement came quietly, almost humbly. Sarah Whitmore was no longer listed as Jonathan's secretary. Her new title, Chief of Staff. It wasn't just a promotion. It was a recognition of what she had been all along, the anchor in the storm, the steady presence who had seen what others overlooked. When the news spread through the company, some raised eyebrows, some whispered questions, but no one who had witnessed the past weeks could deny she had earned it. That evening, the city glowed beneath the autumn sky. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant fireplaces. On the penthouse balcony, Jonathan and Sarah sat side by side, a small plate between them. On it rested 2 slices of apple pie, bought from the bakery down the street where the owner still remembered Jonathan's mother. They ate slowly, sharing bites, the world below them humming with its usual restless energy. But up here, there was only quiet companionship. Jonathan leaned against the railing, fork in hand. "You know," he said softly. "For years I thought legacy was about how many buildings bore your name, how many contracts you closed, how many people whispered your influence in rooms you weren't in." He set the fork down, his gaze drifting across the Denver lights. "But I was wrong. A true legacy isn't about power. It's about love that doesn't vanish when you're gone." Sarah looked at him, the city reflected in her eyes. "Your mother knew that," she said gently. He nodded, a faint smile curving his lips. "And now, so do I." They sat in silence for a while, the pie growing cold between them. It didn't matter. Some moments weren't meant to be hurried. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. Jonathan covered her hand with his thumb brushing softly over her knuckles. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence. He simply breathed and let himself be. The night stretched on, the lights of Denver twinkling like a constellation at their feet. And then came the voice, not Jonathan's, not Sarah's, but the gentle cadence of a narrator's reflection. We chase success. We chase security. We chase the illusion of control. But in the end, what remains? Not titles, not power. What remains are the hands we held when the world was falling apart. The voices that whispered, "Don't leave me." The love that doesn't vanish when you're gone. The screen of memory lingered on Sarah and Jonathan, the city humming behind them, the apple pie, unfinished but enough. And then, softly, the narrator's final words. "Tell me, would you forgive someone who finally told you the truth?" What we witnessed in Jonathan Hale's story is more than a corporate drama. It is a mirror to our own lives. Power, wealth, titles, they may impress for a season, but they cannot hold us when we fall. What carried Jonathan through his darkest hour was not his influence, but the quiet, steadfast presence of someone who refused to leave. Sarah's loyalty reminds us that the people who matter most are often the ones overlooked. A kind word, a listening ear, a small gesture of trust, these may seem ordinary, yet they become lifelines when the storms arrive. And Jonathan's awakening shows that legacy is not built on control or reputation, but on the love and integrity we leave behind. For those of us who have lived long enough to see life's ups and downs, the message is clear. Guard your heart more than your achievements. Nurture relationships that stand even when everything else shakes. Because at the end of the day, when the lights fade and the titles vanish, what will remain are the hands we held, the truths we lived, and the love that does not vanish when we are gone. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Stories like this remind us that behind every title and every struggle, there are hearts that long to be seen and understood. If this story touched you, please give it a like. Share it with someone who might need the reminder. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your presence here means more than you know.